My name is Megan, and at 34 years old, I never expected a simple act of kindness would completely transform my life. It was Christmas Day, and I was driving home from my 12-hour shift at Denver Memorial Hospital, exhausted and emotionally drained. My daughter Emma was with her father for the holidays, and the empty passenger seat reminded me of everything I was missing. That's when I saw them, an elderly couple standing helplessly beside their car on the snow-covered highway, and something inside me couldn't just drive past. Before I share what happened next, I'd love to know where you're spending your holidays. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that Christmas miracles still happen, because what unfolded 10 days later proved to me that sometimes the universe has plans we could never imagine. The Colorado winter was showing no mercy that Christmas afternoon. Snow fell in thick sheets across Interstate 25, and my old Honda Civic struggled against the wind that seemed determined to push me off the road. 3 years had passed since my divorce, and this was my third Christmas working while other nurses celebrated with their families. The extra holiday pay helped, but it couldn't fill the emptiness I felt knowing Emma was opening presents at her father's house without me. I'd been driving for maybe 20 minutes when I spotted them. The old Buick sat at an awkward angle on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking weakly through the storm. An elderly man stood beside the rear tire, his thin jacket no match for the weather, while a woman remained in the passenger seat. My first instinct was to keep driving. I was exhausted, soaked in the smell of hospital disinfectant, and desperately wanted to get home to my empty apartment and sleep. But something about the way the old man kept rubbing his hands together, the way his shoulders hunched against the cold, made me slow down. I pulled over about 50 feet ahead of them and grabbed my emergency kit from the trunk. The wind hit me immediately, cutting through my scrubs like they were made of paper. As I approached, the elderly man looked up with a mixture of relief and surprise. His name was Harold. He told me, his voice shaking either from cold or age, maybe both. He was 82 years old, and his wife Dorothy, 79, hadn't wanted to get out in the cold. They'd been heading home from their church's morning service when the tire went flat. Harold had managed to get the jack and spare tire out, but his arthritis made it impossible to loosen the lug nuts. Dorothy rolled down her window when she saw me approach. She had the kindest blue eyes I'd ever seen, though there was something distant in them, something not quite focused on the present moment. She asked me if I was there for Christmas dinner, then offered me a sugar cookie from a tin she pulled from her purse. The cookies were clearly homemade, probably baked days ago for church, and despite everything, I took one. While I worked on the tire, Harold tried to help, insisting he could at least hold the flashlight, even though the sun hadn't set yet. His hands shook so badly that the beam danced across the snow, but I didn't have the heart to tell him I didn't need it. Dorothy got out of the car despite Harold's protests, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. She stood there watching me work occasionally, asking Harold when Jennifer would arrive for dinner. The lug nuts were frozen solid, and I had to use all my body weight to break them free. Just as I got the third one loose, a semi-truck barreled past too close to the shoulder, sending a wave of gray slush across my back. The icy water soaked through my scrubs instantly, and I couldn't suppress a gasp. Dorothy immediately shuffled over, trying to brush the slush off with her mittened hands, calling me Jennifer, and saying something about how I always got so dirty helping Daddy in the garage. Harold's eyes filled with tears as he gently guided Dorothy back to the car. When he returned, he explained quietly that Jennifer was their daughter. She'd been a nurse too, worked at Presbyterian Hospital for 15 years, before a drunk driver took her life 5 years ago. Dorothy's memory had been slipping since then, and sometimes she forgot Jennifer was gone. I finished changing the tire in silence after that, my own eyes burning with tears that had nothing to do with the cold. My mother had died when I was 12. Cancer took her in just 6 months, and I understood the weight of that kind of loss. When I finally got the spare secured and lowered the car, Harold grabbed my hand with both of his. His skin felt like paper, cold and fragile, but his grip was firm. He insisted on paying me, pulling out a wallet held together with a rubber band, but I refused. Instead, I asked if I could follow them home just to make sure they got there safely on the spare. Harold and Dorothy lived in Park Hill, one of Denver's older neighborhoods, where small brick houses sat on tree-lined streets. Their home looked exactly like you'd imagine: white siding with green shutters, a front porch with a swing covered in snow, and Christmas lights from probably the 1980s strung across the gutters. Half the bulbs were out, but the ones that worked cast a warm glow in the gathering dusk. I planned to see them safely inside and leave, but Dorothy wouldn't hear of it. She insisted I come in for hot cocoa, said I was soaked through and would catch my death. Harold added his voice to hers, and truthfully, I was freezing. My wet scrubs clung to my skin, and I'd been shivering for the last 10 minutes of the drive. Their living room was a time capsule. Wood paneling covered the walls, and every surface held framed photographs. Dorothy led me to the kitchen, while Harold turned up the thermostat and brought me a towel and one of Jennifer's old sweaters he pulled from a hall closet. It still smelled faintly of lavender, and wearing it felt both wrong and somehow comforting. While Dorothy heated milk on the stove, the old-fashioned way, Harold showed me around the photos. Their wedding picture from 1962. Harold in his army uniform and Dorothy in a dress she'd sewn herself. Their son Mark as a baby then, at his high school graduation, then at his wedding to a woman named Patricia. And Jennifer, so many pictures of Jennifer. As a baby, a toddler missing her front teeth, a teenager in a prom dress, and finally in her nursing school graduation photo. I stopped at that one, recognizing the pin on her uniform. She'd graduated from the same nursing program I had just 12 years earlier. When I mentioned this to Harold, his whole face lit up. He pulled out a photo album and showed me pictures of Jennifer at Denver Memorial, my hospital. She'd worked in pediatrics, and in one group photo, I recognized several nurses who were now senior staff. Jennifer had trained some of the people who trained me. Dorothy finished the hot cocoa and served it in Christmas mugs that probably dated back to the 70s. She'd also set out a plate of cookies and what looked like half a coffee cake. As we sat at their kitchen table, she kept touching my hand, calling me Jennifer, asking about my shift at the hospital. Harold would gently correct her each time, but she'd forget again within minutes. That's when I noticed the dining room table through the doorway. It was set for Christmas dinner, complete with china crystal glasses and a centerpiece of artificial poinsettias. But there were only 2 place settings. Harold saw me looking and explained they'd prepared a whole turkey breast and all the fixings habit, really, from when the kids would come home. Mark lived in San Francisco now, some big tech job that kept him busy. He'd sent a gift basket, but couldn't make it out this year. I thought about my own empty apartment, the frozen dinner waiting in my freezer, and made a decision. I asked if they'd mind if I called my daughter to say Merry Christmas. Dorothy's face lit up like I'd offered her the moon. I video called Emma on my phone, and she answered immediately, her face bright with excitement about the dollhouse Santa had brought her. When I explained where I was, Emma, in that way only 8-year-olds can, immediately asked if the nice grandparents were lonely on Christmas. Dorothy heard her and started crying happy tears, reaching for the phone to see the pretty little girl. Emma chatted with them like she'd known them forever, showing them her new toys through the screen, and then looked at me with those serious eyes she got from her father and said I should stay and have dinner with them so they wouldn't be alone. Harold insisted it was too much trouble. They couldn't ask me to give up my Christmas evening, but Dorothy was already setting a third place at the dining room table, humming Silent Night under her breath. And honestly, I didn't want to go home to my empty apartment, so I stayed. The turkey was a little dry, and Dorothy had forgotten to add sugar to the cranberry sauce, but it was one of the best Christmas dinners I'd ever had. Harold told stories about his 40 years running an auto repair shop, how he'd met Dorothy when she brought in her father's car for an oil change in 1960. Dorothy, in her clearer moments, talked about her years teaching 3rd grade, how she'd loved seeing children learn to read. As I helped clear the dishes, Dorothy had one of her clear moments. She looked right at me, really seeing me, and said, "You're not Jennifer. Jennifer's gone. But you're here, and that's a blessing." Then she hugged me, and I found myself crying into this stranger's shoulder, while Harold rubbed my back with his arthritic hands. Before I left, they insisted on packing up leftover turkey and pie for me to take home. Harold walked me to my car, the snow still falling softly around us. He thanked me again for stopping, said most people would have just driven by. I told him I was glad I'd stopped, and I meant it. As I drove away, I watched in my rearview mirror as he stood on the porch, making sure I got safely down the street. The days after Christmas fell back into their familiar routine. December 26th meant another 12-hour shift, this time in the emergency department, dealing with post-holiday accidents and family dispute injuries. December 27th brought overtime in the ICU, covering for nurses who'd called in sick after too much holiday celebration. My ex-husband called to complain that I'd missed Emma's Christmas morning again, conveniently forgetting he'd specifically requested to have her for the entire holiday week. But something was different. I couldn't stop thinking about Harold and Dorothy during my lunch breaks instead of scrolling through social media and feeling sorry for myself. I found myself wondering if they'd eaten the leftover turkey, if Harold had managed to get a proper tire to replace the spare, if Dorothy was having a good day or a confused one. Emma asked about them every night during our phone calls. She'd named them Grandma Dorothy and Grandpa Harold without any prompting, and wanted to know if they'd like the cookies she'd seen on their table, if they had any pets, if their house had a backyard with a swing set. Her innocent questions made me realize how much she missed having grandparents. My mother was gone. My father had remarried and moved to Florida with a woman who made it clear grandchildren weren't part of her retirement plan. Her father's parents lived in Boston and only saw Emma once a year, if that. On December 29th, my first day off in a week, I found myself driving to Park Hill. I hadn't planned it, just got in my car to run errands and somehow ended up on their street. Harold was in the driveway trying to shovel snow with movements that were painful to watch. I parked and took the shovel from his hands before he could protest. He pretended to be upset about accepting help, but I could see the relief in his eyes. His back had been aching something fierce, he admitted, and Dorothy had been trying to come out and do it herself, which worried him more than the unshoveled snow. As I cleared the driveway and front walk, Harold kept me company, talking about the weather, the Broncos' disappointing season, anything except how obviously grateful he was for the help. When I finished, Dorothy appeared at the door with a plate of cookies freshly baked that morning. She called me Jennifer again, but this time it didn't sting as much. She'd made sugar cookies with green and red sprinkles, the kind Emma loved. I mentioned this without thinking, and Dorothy immediately began packing up half the batch for me to take to my daughter. That's when Harold asked if I might be willing to exchange phone numbers, just in case they needed something, he said, looking embarrassed. They didn't want to be a bother, but sometimes Dorothy got confused about how to use their phone, and it would be nice to have someone local to call. I programmed my number into their ancient flip phone and made Harold promise to call if they needed anything at all. New Year's Eve came with another hospital shift, but this time I didn't mind as much. The emergency department was busy, but not chaotic, mostly people who'd started celebrating too early. I thought about calling Harold and Dorothy at midnight, but figured they'd be long asleep. I was wrong. At 12:03 in the morning, my phone rang. Harold's voice was shaky and scared. Dorothy had gotten up to use the bathroom and fallen. She seemed okay, just shaken up, but he couldn't get her off the floor by himself. I told him to hang up and call 911, but he begged me to come instead. They'd had bad experiences with paramedics before, he said, and Dorothy got so frightened when strangers came to the house. I made it to their house in 15 minutes. Dorothy was sitting on the bathroom floor, confused, but apparently unhurt. Together, Harold and I got her to her feet and back to bed. I did a basic neurological check, looked for signs of a head injury, checked her range of motion. Everything seemed fine, but I made them promise to see their doctor after the holiday. January 2nd found me back at their house this time, helping them navigate the maze of Medicare paperwork for Dorothy's doctor visit. Their dining room table was covered in medical bills, insurance statements, and prescription receipts. Harold tried to explain their system, but it was clear they were overwhelmed. Dorothy's medications alone required a spreadsheet to track properly. As I sorted through papers, organizing them into something manageable, Harold mentioned something that stopped me cold. They were thinking about selling the house, not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't keep up with it anymore. The stairs were getting harder for Dorothy. Harold couldn't maintain the yard, and they'd gotten 3 notices from the city about their sidewalk needing repair. The thought of them leaving this home with all its memories, all those photographs, broke my heart. But I understood. My grandmother had fought the same battle before we finally had to move her to assisted living. I just wish there was another way. January 4th started like any other day. I was helping Emma get ready for school, braiding her hair, while she chattered about her friend's new puppy, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a San Francisco area code. My first thought was telemarketer, but something made me answer. The voice on the other end was professional, but warm, introducing himself as Mark Harold and Dorothy's son. He'd just gotten off the phone with his parents, who'd spent 20 minutes telling him about the wonderful nurse named Megan who'd been helping them. His father had mentioned me 3 times in one conversation, which was apparently unusual enough to catch Mark's attention. He was flying into Denver tomorrow, he said, and wondered if I might be willing to meet him at his parents' house. He wanted to thank me in person and maybe get my perspective on how they were really doing. Harold always said everything was fine, had been saying it for years, but Mark suspected that wasn't entirely true. I agreed to meet him, though I felt strange about it, like I was somehow betraying Harold and Dorothy's trust. But someone needed to know the reality of their situation, and if their son was finally ready to hear it, maybe something could be done. Mark wasn't what I'd expected. Based on Harold's stories, I'd pictured some cold tech executive who'd chosen career over family. Instead, I met a man in his mid-50s with Harold's eyes and Dorothy's gentle smile, wearing jeans and a Colorado Rockies sweatshirt he'd apparently kept from high school. The first thing he did was pull me into a hug, thanking me for being there when he couldn't be. We sat in Harold and Dorothy's living room while they napped upstairs, and Mark opened his laptop to show me something. Email after email from his parents, all saying the same thing. Everything's fine. Don't worry about us. The weather's good. Your father fixed the kitchen sink. Your mother's having a good week. Reading them in sequence, I could see how carefully they'd hidden their struggles. Mark showed me text messages he'd tried to send photos from Emma's birthday last year that his parents never saw, because they couldn't figure out how to open attachments. He'd offered to fly them out to San Francisco for Thanksgiving, but they'd declined, saying travel was too hard at their age. He'd suggested hiring help, but Harold's pride wouldn't allow it. He'd even researched senior communities in Denver, but knew better than to bring it up. Then Mark told me something that changed everything. When Jennifer died, she'd been on her way to visit them. She'd worked a double shift, but insisted on driving over because Dorothy had been having a particularly bad day. The drunk driver hit her just 3 blocks from their house. Mark had been in Shanghai on business, had to fly 20 hours to get home for the funeral. The guilt of not being there for Jennifer or for his parents had been eating at him ever since. But there was more. Jennifer had saved his life once, literally. When Mark was 25, he'd been diagnosed with leukemia. Jennifer, then just 19, had been a perfect bone marrow match. She'd dropped out of college for a semester to be his donor, stayed with him through every treatment, held his hand through the worst of it. She'd given him 30 more years of life, and he'd been on another continent when she lost hers. Mark composed himself and told me his plan. He wanted to set up a care fund in Jennifer's name, something that would pay for home health services, maintenance, whatever his parents needed to stay in their house. But he needed someone local to coordinate it, someone his parents already trusted. He offered me a position as their care coordinator, 20 hours a week, enough to significantly supplement my hospital income without requiring me to leave my job. I was stunned. I started to refuse, saying I'd help them because it was the right thing to do, not for money. But Mark stopped me. He showed me photos of his daughter away at college in Boston who barely knew her grandparents. His son starting high school in San Francisco, who'd met them maybe 5 times. He couldn't move back to Denver. His wife's whole family was in California. His job required him to be on the West Coast. But he could do this. He needed to do this. The conversation with Harold and Dorothy didn't go as smoothly as Mark had hoped. Harold's pride flared up immediately when Mark mentioned hiring help. They didn't need charity, he insisted, especially not from their own son. They'd managed just fine for 79 years, and they could manage a few more. Dorothy, confused by the tension, kept asking why everyone looked so upset. I watched Mark try to navigate his father's stubbornness, saw him struggling with decades of careful distance between them. Finally, I asked if I could speak. I looked directly at Harold and told him this wasn't about charity. It was about Jennifer. Everything Mark wanted to do was to honor his sister's memory. Jennifer had dedicated her life to helping others, and this fund would continue that legacy. Dorothy, who'd been quiet, suddenly spoke up with perfect clarity. She looked at Harold and said Jennifer would haunt them both if they refused help that could keep them in their home. She wanted to die in the house where she'd raised her children, not in some nursing facility. If accepting help meant she could stay, then her pride could take a back seat. The room went silent. Harold's eyes filled with tears, and he reached for Dorothy's hand. They'd been so focused on not being a burden that they hadn't considered what their stubbornness might cost them. Slowly, Harold nodded his agreement. But I had a suggestion for compromise. Instead of framing it as hired help, why not let me simply be their friend who happened to visit regularly? I could bring Emma by after school sometimes. She desperately wanted grandparents, and they clearly missed having young people around. The care coordination could happen naturally without making Harold feel like he was accepting charity. Mark's face lit up at this solution. He immediately expanded on the idea. Beyond the home care, he wanted to establish a nursing scholarship at Denver Memorial in Jennifer's name. He'd been looking for a way to honor her memory, and what better way than helping other single mothers become nurses, just like Jennifer had helped so many people during her career. The transformation in Harold was remarkable. The idea of Jennifer's name living on helping other young women achieve their dreams broke through his pride in a way nothing else could. He stood up slowly and carefully and embraced his son for what I suspected was the first time in years. Over the next 2 weeks, everything moved quickly. Mark extended his stay in Denver, working from his parents' kitchen table while setting everything in motion. A home health aide began coming 3 mornings a week, introduced as my friend Maria, who needed to practice her caregiving skills. A lawn service appeared, supposedly a gift from Mark's company. A handyman fixed the loose porch rail and the dripping kitchen faucet things Harold had been meaning to get to for months. Emma started visiting after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Harold taught her to play checkers, then chess, while Dorothy supervised cookie baking that left my daughter covered in flour but glowing with happiness. Emma's presence seemed to anchor Dorothy to the present more effectively than any medication. She rarely called Emma by Jennifer's name, instead delighting in this little girl who hung on her every word. My financial stress, which had been a constant companion since the divorce, began to ease. The coordinator position paid well, and more importantly, it felt meaningful. I wasn't just earning extra money, I was helping preserve something precious, keeping a family together, despite the challenges of age and distance. February brought unexpected snow and unexpected joy. The scholarship Mark established was more generous than he'd initially mentioned, a $100,000 endowment that would fund 2 nursing students each year. The hospital held a ceremony to announce it, and Harold and Dorothy insisted on attending despite the weather. Dorothy wore the dress she'd worn to Jennifer's nursing school graduation, still perfectly preserved after all these years. Harold put on his only suit, the one he'd bought for Jennifer's funeral, and hadn't worn since. As we sat in the hospital auditorium, Dorothy held my hand on one side and Emma's on the other, clear and present for the entire ceremony. The first scholarship recipient was announced, a 23-year-old single mother named Rosa, who'd been working 3 jobs to pay for nursing school. When she stood to accept the award, tears streaming down her face. As she thanked the family who'd made it possible, Harold broke down completely. Dorothy comforted him, whispering that Jennifer would be so proud. After the ceremony, the hospital's chief of staff approached us. She'd known Jennifer had worked with her in pediatrics before moving into administration. She told Harold and Dorothy stories about their daughter. I don't think they'd ever heard about children whose lives Jennifer had saved families. She'd comforted young nurses she'd mentored. Each story was a gift, adding new dimensions to the daughter they'd lost. March arrived with its promise of spring, and with it came unexpected legal documents. Harold and Dorothy had updated their will, adding provisions I never expected. They'd set up a college fund for Emma, not a fortune, but enough to make a difference. They'd named me as their medical power of attorney, trusting me to make decisions if they couldn't. Mark not only supported these choices, but seemed relieved by them. The relationship between Mark and his parents had transformed completely. He visited monthly, now bringing his family when he could. His son, 16-year-old David, discovered Harold's collection of vintage car magazines and spent hours discussing engines with his grandfather. Mark's daughter came during her spring break from college, interviewing Dorothy about her teaching career for a psychology paper. But the most remarkable change was in Dorothy. While her dementia hadn't reversed, it had stabilized. The combination of regular routine, proper medication management, and constant social interaction seemed to slow its progression. She had more clear days, more moments of perfect presence. The fear and confusion that had marked so many of her days gave way to a kind of peaceful acceptance. One afternoon in April, as Emma helped Dorothy plant flowers in the garden boxes Harold had built at wheelchair height, Dorothy turned to me with complete clarity. She told me about the day Jennifer died, how she'd felt her daughter's presence in the room, how Jennifer had whispered that everything would be okay, that someone would come to help. Dorothy believed I was that someone sent by Jennifer to make sure her parents weren't alone. Whether you believe in divine intervention or simple coincidence, I couldn't deny the perfection of how our lives had intertwined. Harold teaching Emma about resilience and hard work, while she gave him purpose beyond his own mortality. Dorothy showing my daughter the art of patience and unconditional love, while Emma reminded her of the continuity of life. Mark finding redemption in action rather than guilt, and me discovering that family isn't just about blood, but about showing up when needed. By May, our routine had become beautifully ordinary. Sunday dinners at Harold and Dorothy's house, Emma's artwork covering their refrigerator, Harold at every one of Emma's soccer games cheering louder than any biological grandparent, Dorothy teaching Emma to knit their fingers, working together to create scarves no one would ever wear, but everyone would treasure. The house that had once felt like a museum to grief had become alive again. New photos joined the old ones on the walls. Emma on Harold's lap reading a book. Dorothy and me baking Emma's 9th birthday cake. Mark's family gathered around the Christmas tree they'd helped Harold set up. Life continuing despite loss because of love. One evening in early June, as we sat on their porch watching Emma catch fireflies in the yard, Harold told me something he'd never shared before. The day Jennifer died, he'd been angry at God, at the world, at himself for every harsh word he'd ever spoken to her. He'd wanted to die too, would have welcomed it except for Dorothy needing him. But that Christmas day when I'd stopped to help, when I'd followed them home and stayed for dinner, he'd felt something shift. Not healing exactly, but the possibility of it. Dorothy, having one of her clear evenings, added her own perspective. She said losing Jennifer had been like losing the ability to see colors, everything turning gray and meaningless. But Emma's laughter had brought back yellow. My persistence had returned blue. Mark's renewed presence had restored green. The world wasn't the same without Jennifer, could never be, but it was no longer colorless. As spring turned to summer, I realized the profound truth of our situation. I'd thought I was helping them, these elderly strangers stranded on a snowy highway, but they'd helped me just as much. They'd given Emma the grandparents she desperately needed. They'd shown me that family can be chosen, created from kindness rather than chromosomes. They'd taught me that grief and joy can coexist, that loss doesn't negate love, but can actually deepen it. The scholarship recipients started visiting Harold and Dorothy regularly, young women pursuing Jennifer's profession, who wanted to thank the people making their dreams possible. Each visit brought new energy to the house, new stories of lives being changed. Harold kept a photo album of all the scholarship recipients, adding their graduation photos next to Jennifer's, proof that his daughter's legacy lived on. Emma's 9th birthday party in July was held at Harold and Dorothy's house. Not because we planned it that way, but because, when asked where she wanted to celebrate, she couldn't imagine anywhere else. Dorothy made her famous chocolate cake, the same recipe she'd used for Jennifer and Mark's birthdays decades ago. Harold gave Emma a jewelry box he'd made in his garage workshop, spending weeks getting it perfect despite his arthritis. During the party, surrounded by Emma's friends and their parents, many of whom had heard so much about Grandma Dorothy and Grandpa Harold, Dorothy had a moment of stunning clarity. She stood up steady and sure and made a toast to family. Not the family you're born into, she said, but the family you find along the way. She looked directly at me and said, "Thank you for stopping that Christmas day. Thank you for seeing two old people who needed help and choosing not to drive by." The room was silent except for the sound of sniffling as everyone wiped away tears. Then Emma, my brave, beautiful daughter, raised her cup of lemonade and said to Harold and Dorothy that they were the best grandparents anyone could ask for, biological or not. The cheer that went up could probably be heard 3 blocks away. As summer progressed, Harold's health remained relatively stable. At 83, he moved slowly but determinedly. He'd accepted the walker I'd convinced him to use, mainly because Emma had decorated it with Bronco stickers. Dorothy's good days outnumbered her bad ones, especially when she stuck to her routine and medications. The house modifications Mark had paid for grab bars in the bathroom, a stair lift, a walk-in shower meant they could navigate their home safely. Mark's visits had become highlights rather than obligations. He'd bring his laptop and work from their kitchen, while Dorothy made him sandwiches. And Harold told the same stories about Mark's childhood that he'd told a dozen times before. But now Mark listened differently, hearing love in the repetition rather than senility. His teenagers had started asking to come along, drawn by Harold's stories and Dorothy's cookies, but staying for the genuine connection. One August evening, as we all sat in the backyard watching the sunset, Harold pulled me aside. He wanted me to know that he'd lived a good life, that however many days he had left, they were bonus time. He'd been ready to give up after Jennifer died, had only kept going for Dorothy. But now he had reasons to wake up each morning. Emma's visits, Mark's calls, the scholarship recipients stopping by to share their successes. He felt useful again, needed. I understood what he was really saying. He was preparing me, making sure I knew that when his time came, it would be okay. He'd found peace, purpose, and most importantly, he'd seen his family not just survive tragedy, but grow stronger from it. He made me promise to take care of Dorothy, to make sure Emma kept visiting, to help Mark forgive himself for all the years he'd stayed away. That December, exactly 1 year after I'd changed their tire, we all gathered for Christmas dinner. The same dining room table that had been set for two lonely people now barely accommodated everyone. Mark and his family had flown in from San Francisco. Emma and I were there, of course. Maria, the home health aide who'd become genuinely fond of Harold and Dorothy, joined us. Even Rosa, the first scholarship recipient, stopped by with her two young children. Dorothy had been cooking for days, supervised by Maria and me, to ensure safety, but determined to make all of Jennifer's favorite dishes. Harold had strung new Christmas lights, the LED kind, that wouldn't burn out like the old ones. Emma had made everyone ornaments in her art class, each one personalized and precious. As Harold said grace before dinner, he thanked God for the flat tire that had brought me into their lives. He thanked Jennifer for sending us an angel in scrubs. He thanked Mark for having the courage to come home and the wisdom to honor his sister. He thanked Emma for bringing light back into their dark house. And he thanked Dorothy for 61 years of marriage, for her strength in the face of loss, for teaching him that accepting help wasn't weakness, but wisdom. Dorothy, clear and present, added her own prayer. She thanked God for second chances for families that form in unexpected ways, for the gift of memory, even when it sometimes failed her. She said Jennifer would be so happy to see us all together, that this was what she'd always wanted, a full house with laughter and love. After dinner, as we exchanged gifts and watched Emma perform the Christmas play she'd practiced for weeks, I thought about the journey we'd all traveled. 1 year ago, I'd been alone, exhausted, going through the motions of a life that felt empty, despite my desperate love for Emma. Harold and Dorothy had been isolated, struggling, too proud to ask for help, and too forgotten to receive it anyway. Mark had been successful, but guilt-ridden, disconnected from his parents and the memory of his sister. Emma had been loved but lonely, missing the extended family her friends took for granted. Now look at us, a patchwork family stitched together by circumstance and choice. Harold had become the grandfather Emma never had, teaching her patience and perseverance. Dorothy, even in her confusion, had shown us all how to find joy in simple moments. Mark had discovered that success meant nothing without connection, that showing up late was better than not showing up at all. Emma had learned that family extends beyond blood, that love multiplies when freely given. And me, I'd learned the most important lesson of all. That Christmas day, I thought I was just changing a tire. I thought I was performing a simple act of kindness for strangers who needed help. But I was really accepting an invitation to a different kind of life, one where isolation gives way to connection, where helping others helps yourself, where the family you choose can be just as real as the family you're born into. As the evening wound down, and Mark's family headed to their hotel, as Maria hugged everyone goodbye, as Emma fell asleep on Harold's shoulder, while he told one last story, Dorothy took my hand. She was completely lucid, her eyes clear and knowing. She said Jennifer had kept her promise. When she'd whispered that someone would come to help, she'd meant it. And that someone was me, but not just me. It was all of us, each playing our part in keeping a family together despite lost distance and time. I drove home that night with Emma sleeping in the back seat, snow falling gently on the windshield, just like it had 1 year ago. But everything had changed. The empty feeling that had haunted me for 3 years was gone, replaced by a fullness I hadn't known was possible. I had parents again, not by birth, but by choice. Emma had grandparents who adored her. Mark had found his way home. Harold and Dorothy had a reason to keep going. Sometimes the universe puts you exactly where you need to be at exactly the right moment. That Christmas day, I thought I was just being a good Samaritan helping strangers with a flat tire. But I was really finding my way home to a family I never expected to. A love that transcended biology, to a reminder that the best gifts don't come wrapped in paper. They come in the form of connections we never saw coming. Relationships that transform not just our circumstances, but our understanding of what family really means. 10 days after that flat tire, when Mark first called me, everything did change, but not in the way I expected. I thought I might help coordinate some care for a sweet elderly couple. Instead, I gained parents who filled the void my mother's death had left. Emma gained grandparents who treasure every moment with her. Mark gained redemption and reconnection. Harold and Dorothy gained the extended family Jennifer would have given them if she'd lived. The scholarship recipients who visit regularly, the neighborhood kids who've started stopping by for Dorothy's cookies, the church friends who now check in more often. Because they see Harold and Dorothy thriving, all of these ripples started with one moment of choosing to stop instead of driving by. One moment of seeing need and deciding to meet it. One moment that changed everything. As I finish sharing this story with you, Harold is about to turn 84. He's teaching Emma to change oil in my car, his arthritic hands guiding her young ones. Dorothy is in the kitchen with Maria making soup for a sick neighbor, humming the same hymns she's hummed for 60 years. Mark is flying in next week with his whole family for Harold's birthday. The house that once felt like it was dying is alive with purpose and love. And me, I'm sitting on their porch, the same one where Harold thanked me for stopping that Christmas day watching Emma chase the dog they adopted last month, because every grandchild needs a dog at Grandma and Grandpa's house. I'm thinking about how sometimes the best families are the ones you choose, the ones formed not by obligation, but by opportunity, not by blood, but by blessing. That Christmas day, I helped an elderly couple with a flat tire. 10 days later, everything changed in a way I never expected. But now I understand it wasn't really about the tire at all. It was about being willing to stop when others drive by. It was about seeing beyond the immediate need to the deeper connection possible. It was about learning that family isn't just who you're related to, but who you relate with. If you've made it this far in our story, I want to ask you something. When was the last time you stopped to help someone who needed it? When did you last choose connection over convenience? What opportunities for unexpected family might you be driving past? Please share your own stories of unexpected connections in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories about the families we choose and the moments that change everything. And if you know someone who needs to hear that, it's never too late to find family. That connection can come from the most unexpected places. Please share this story with them. Thank you for letting me share this journey with you. And remember, sometimes the best gifts come disguised as flat tires on snowy highways. May you find your own unexpected family, and may you be that unexpected family for someone else who needs it.